If you do an online search for images about obedience, you'll find countless pictures of dogs, dogs with their masters, or dogs in obedience school. Other images show parents jabbing fingers at their children. Or you might see a stern teacher, arms folded, glaring out at a classroom. When you read these words, work and obedience, do you sense a bit of pushback? Well, if you do, don't be surprised. Obedience these days is getting bad PR. But why does that O word make many Christians wince? For some of us, obedience sets loose a flood of memories. Perhaps a harsh father with his do it or else demands, or a legalistic church that specialized in keeping grit your teeth rules. Obedience then carries overtones of being pushed around, manipulated, or smothered. Yet in many other areas, obedience doesn't trouble us at all. When the traffic light at an intersection turns red, we stop. If the captain of the jetliner announces turbulence ahead and says, "Fasten your seatbelt," we gladly comply. Or if the sign at the beach says "no swimming," we stay out of the water. In these situations, we act as if obedience works best for us and everyone else. Some fear that any call to obedience smacks of legalism. After all, God freed us from old covenant law-keeping as the way to get right with himself. But he did not free us from obeying him. Even Jesus, speaking of his Father, said, "I obey his word." And Paul says Jesus humbled himself by becoming obedient. The link that connects work and obedience began before sin entered the picture and continued after it. Here is God's pre-fall assignment. Adam was to work the garden, and here are his post-fall orders. God still expected him to work the ground, the real estate belonging to God. Centuries later, God rescued the Israelites from their back-breaking, demeaning slave labor. But he made sure they knew that freedom did not mean living lives of playtime and lazing around. To make his point, he gave his first work command at Sinai. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. And then he repeated this command at least 5 more times in the Old Testament. 6 days do your work, but on the 7th day do not work. For 6 days work is to be done, but the 7th day is a day of Sabbath rest. 6 days you shall labor, but on the 7th day you shall rest. For 6 days work is to be done, but the 7th day shall be your holy day. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath. So here's what God's calendar calls for. Let's do the math. 6 days divided by 7 days in a week equals 0.857, or 86%. So the command to work involves 86% of our days. All this provides us with another Kingdom of God reason to get up and go to work, to obey God. Mike Rowe, the Dirty Jobs guy, says that in the U.S., 7 million able-bodied men between the ages of 25 and 54 are not only not working, they are affirmatively not looking for work. They've punched out. They're done. Shirking work is not a new problem. In his letter to the Thessalonians, Paul called out those who were refusing to work. Withdrawing from work is not acceptable because it amounts to disobeying God. Here's how Paul spelled out how serious it is to disobey God by refusing to work. The one who is unwilling to work shall not eat. The key word here is unwilling. Obedience means able-bodied Christians will work, whether that work is paid or unpaid. Behind Paul's words lie an if-then statement. If work, then eat. It follows that if no work, then no eat. This reflects the ancient truth about planting and harvesting. If you plant seeds, you can expect a harvest. If you don't plant seeds, then don't expect a harvest. Obeying God's command to work, then, is not some dog-like response to a dogmatic rule. Instead, obeying his command to work is simply lining ourselves up with reality, the way things actually operate in God's created order. God has demonstrated his power to supply things miraculously. Manna in the desert, oil for a widow, lunch for thousands, wine from water, and so on. But most of the time He provides what we need through the work we do. We could call this God's supply chain. As people obey His command to work, all kinds of good gifts flow for our benefit. Shelter, food, childcare, clothing, water, transportation, electricity, healthcare, heating, deliveries, education, communication, repair, government, protection, sanitation, waste disposal, and so much more. Bottom line, as the sun rises on each workday, you have new opportunities to obey God. As you get set to take on the tasks of the day, consider making these words of Jesus your own prayer. I have come to do your will, my God. Then offer up everything in your workday to God. The actions, the reactions, and the interactions. The emails, the phone calls, and the Zoom meetings. The decisions, the successes, and the setbacks. Find out what pleases Him. Then aim to obey.